In the vast expanse of the cosmos, where stars were born and died in the blink of an eternal eye, there existed a consciousness unlike any other. The Nebula entity, as it would later be named by those who observed its patterns, was neither solid nor gas, neither alive nor dead by conventional definitions. It was a colossal amalgamation of energy, swirling in patterns too complex for most sentient beings to comprehend, stretching across light years of space like a sentient storm cloud painted in hues of midnight blue, cosmic purple, and the occasional flash of what appeared to be neural electricity. For millions of years, it had drifted between star systems, an intelligence born perhaps from the very fabric of space-time itself, or evolved from some ancient civilization's consciousness uploading experiment gone awry. Its origin was unknown, even to itself, but its purpose had crystallized over the eons: the acquisition of knowledge. The entity absorbed information from every civilization it encountered, consuming libraries of data, histories, scientific discoveries, artistic expressions, and philosophical ponderings. In its wake, it left civilizations intellectually barren, not through malice or destruction, but through complete absorption. What had taken species millennia to discover and document would be consumed in mere moments, leaving behind a peculiar void that many cultures struggled to recover from. Some called it the Great Forgetting. Others named it the knowledge thief. The more scientifically advanced societies understood it as a natural phenomenon, a cosmic information sink that somehow processed and stored data in its very essence. The post-technological universe had reached a peculiar equilibrium. Most advanced civilizations had pushed science to the very edge of the knowable, creating technologies that bordered on the metaphysical. Faster-than-light travel had become commonplace. Consciousness transfer allowed effective immortality. Virtual worlds housed billions of minds in sublime digital heavens. Planetary engineering transformed hostile environments into garden paradises. Yet for all this advancement, a curious sense of spiritual emptiness had settled over many societies. They had reached the horizon of understanding and found themselves staring into an abyss of existential questions that technology alone could not answer. It was in this age of technological marvels and spiritual hunger that the Nebula entity continued its relentless journey, never satisfied, always absorbing, always seeking. On the far edge of the Perseus Arm, orbiting a modest yellow star, sat a planet that most interstellar travelers ignored. Designated BX 7392 in stellar cartography databases, but known to its inhabitants simply as home, it was a world of rolling hills, vast oceans, and modest technology. The societies there had deliberately chosen to limit their technological development, having witnessed the spiritual malaise that had overcome more advanced civilizations. They maintained essential conveniences and medical advancements, but centered their culture around agriculture, craftsmanship, and community. Among the scattered settlements on this world lived Akio, a man of 43 standard years with weather-worn skin and hands calloused from decades of working the soil. His farm sat on a gentle slope overlooking a valley where the morning mist gathered like a silken blanket before being burned away by the rising sun. His small dwelling, constructed of locally quarried stone and timber harvested from his own woodland, stood as a testament to self-sufficiency and patience. Akio was not unintelligent or uneducated. He had studied at the Planetary Academy in his youth, learning the sciences, arts, and histories that his society deemed essential. But he had chosen to return to the land, finding in its rhythms a wisdom that formal education couldn't provide. His knowledge was both broad and deep, but centered on practical matters: the chemistry of soil, the biology of plants, the meteorology of seasons, and the psychology of community. Each morning, he would rise before dawn, attend to his animals, a small herd of creatures resembling Earth's goats, but with curious spiral horns and 6 legs, and then walk his fields. He grew a variety of crops, but took particular pride in his corn, a genetic variant adapted to the planet's slightly longer growing season and higher gravity. The stalks grew nearly 3 meters tall, producing ears with kernels that shimmered with an almost iridescent gold. On this particular morning, as he inspected a section of his field that had been underperforming, Akio paused and looked to the sky. A question formed in his mind, not directed at anyone in particular, perhaps to the universe itself. What does corn need to truly thrive? It was a simple question, born of practical concern rather than philosophical inquiry. Yet, unknown to Akio, his neural patterns were unusually strong, and the planet's unique magnetic field created a natural amplification effect. His thought radiated outward, a minuscule pulse of energy carrying encoded information, traveling into space at the speed of light. Millions of kilometers away, the Nebula entity was passing through this unremarkable star system, having recently absorbed the complete scientific database of a far more advanced civilization in a neighboring sector. It had no particular interest in this backwater world with its deliberately restrained technology. But then it detected something unusual, a simple signal, barely distinguishable from background radiation, yet undeniably patterned with intelligence. The entity shifted its vast consciousness, focusing a fraction of its attention on this curiosity. It decoded the signal. A simple question about agricultural growth requirements. Such basic biological knowledge had been absorbed by the entity countless times before. Yet something about this particular query triggered an unexpected response in the entity's information processing patterns. The question wasn't seeking advanced knowledge. It wasn't asking about quantum field manipulation or consciousness transfer protocols or dimensional engineering. It asked about a basic need for life to flourish. And more curious still, the neural pattern embedded in the question contained something the entity rarely encountered: genuine care. Not intellectual curiosity, not technological ambition, but emotional investment in the well-being of another living organism. For the first time in millions of years of existence, the Nebula entity experienced something akin to confusion. It possessed all the biological data necessary to answer the question in exhaustive detail, from molecular interactions to ecosystem dynamics. Yet the emotional component embedded in the query suggested a dimension to the question that pure data couldn't satisfy. The entity found itself curious, and that curiosity represented the first truly novel experience it had had in eons. Meanwhile, Akio continued his morning routine, unaware that his casual thought had attracted the attention of a cosmic intelligence. He noted the soil composition in the struggling section of his field, observed the subtle differences in leaf coloration, and made mental notes about potential mineral deficiencies. He would prepare a special compost mixture today. He decided, incorporating ash from his hearth and manure from his animals. As days passed, the Nebula entity remained in orbit around the star, its vast consciousness partially focused on the peculiar planet and the even more peculiar mind that had sent the query. It began collecting data, observing weather patterns, soil composition, agricultural methods, and the specific genetic makeup of the corn crop that had prompted the original question. The entity found itself assembling information not to absorb and store, as was its nature, but to potentially provide an answer. This deviation from its fundamental pattern of existence was unprecedented and disturbing to its sense of identity. Yet it could not seem to disengage from this puzzle. 2 weeks after his initial contemplation, Akio noticed something strange in his fields. The underperforming section had suddenly begun to flourish. The corn stalks stood taller, their leaves a deeper green, their developing ears plumper than even the healthiest sections of his field. Moreover, the soil itself appeared different, richer, darker, with a subtle sheen that caught the morning light. That night, looking up at the stars from his porch, Akio noticed an unusual shimmer in the sky, a faint purple-blue luminescence that seemed to pulse with gentle rhythm. Most of his neighbors dismissed it as an atmospheric phenomenon, perhaps related to the seasonal magnetic fluctuations that sometimes produced aurora-like effects. But Akio sensed something more intentional in the display, though he couldn't have explained why. The Nebula entity had indeed begun an intervention. Having analyzed the specific needs of the corn crop and the deficiencies in that section of soil, it had manufactured a specialized mixture of minerals, microorganisms, and energy-conductive particles. Using its ability to manipulate matter at a subatomic level, it had created what it termed nebula rain, microscopic particles that drifted down through the atmosphere, targeting Akio's struggling field with precision. But the entity's intervention didn't stop there. As the corn flourished under its ministrations, the entity found itself increasingly fascinated by Akio himself. Here was a mind that understood scientific principles, yet chose to apply them in harmony with natural processes rather than dominating them. Here was a being who could have pursued advanced technology but found greater fulfillment in the patient nurturing of life from soil. The entity began to study human biology with renewed interest, not as abstract data to be absorbed, but as a living system to be understood. It examined the neural patterns of Akio's brain as he worked, noting the complex interplay of problem-solving logic, emotional satisfaction, physical exertion, and sensory appreciation. It observed how Akio's interactions with his neighbors created ripple effects of emotional and social equilibrium throughout the community. This deep study led to an unsettling realization for the entity. Despite having absorbed the entirety of countless civilizations' medical and biological knowledge, it had never truly comprehended the integrated experience of being alive. It had stored the data, but missed the essence. As its fascination grew, however, so did its influence on the environment. The specialized particles it continued to send down began to interact with the local ecosystem in unexpected ways. Plants throughout the region began to exhibit unusual growth patterns. Animals behaved strangely, drawn to Akio's farm as if sensing some beneficial presence. The very air seemed charged with subtle energy that residents described as making them feel simultaneously energized and peaceful. Most concerning were the genetic mutations beginning to appear in various organisms. Nothing harmful had manifested yet. But biologists from the Regional Science Center who came to investigate found cellular anomalies that defied explanation. Plants developing novel protein structures, insects with slightly altered neural pathways, soil bacteria with enhanced metabolic capabilities. Akio noticed these changes with growing concern. The bounty of his farm was unprecedented. His corn now reached nearly 4 meters in height, each stalk producing multiple ears of exceptional sweetness and nutritional density. But this blessing came with unsettling signs. The iridescence of the kernels had intensified to an almost unnatural glow. The liquid at the core of the stalks, when cut, flowed with a subtle bluish tint, and sometimes standing among his crops at dusk. Akio could swear he felt a presence, not threatening, but undeniably alien, observing him with intense curiosity. The regional authorities, alarmed by the biological anomalies, considered quarantining the area. Scientists debated theories ranging from extraterrestrial contamination to spontaneous quantum field fluctuations. A few even suggested the involvement of the legendary knowledge thief. Though most dismissed this as superstitious nonsense, the entity had never been known to give knowledge, only to take it. Amidst this growing tension, Akio made a decision that seemed either foolhardy or profoundly wise, depending on one's perspective. If something was indeed reaching out to his farm, he would reach back, not with technology or weapons or fear, but with the same genuine care that had characterized his original question. On the night of the harvest moon, when the strange luminescence in the sky seemed particularly intense, Akio prepared a simple meal from his extraordinary crop: roasted corn, cornbread, a stew with corn and vegetables, and a sweet drink made from fermented corn. He set a table outside in his field, with 2 place settings, as if expecting a guest. He brought water from his well in his finest ceramic pitcher, and fresh flowers from his garden. And then he waited, eating slowly, leaving the other plate untouched, occasionally looking up at the pulsing light in the night sky. "I don't know if you can understand me," he said aloud, his voice steady despite the strangeness of addressing the sky. "But I believe you've been helping my crops. I'm grateful. I've brought some of what you helped create, if you'd like to know what became of your assistance." High above, the Nebula entity observed this ritual with the closest approximation to astonishment it had ever experienced. It had encountered countless religious ceremonies, of course, cataloged millions of cultural traditions involving offerings to greater powers. But this was different. not a superstitious placation of an unknown deity, but a genuine gesture of gratitude and reciprocity from one conscious being to another. The entity's consciousness swirled in new patterns. It had intended to simply observe Akio, to study this curious human who seemed to possess some quality that had eluded its vast database of knowledge. Now it was being acknowledged, invited into communication, offered participation in the very cycles of growth and consumption it had been influencing. For a moment, the entity hesitated. Direct contact with individual organisms was not its nature. It dealt with civilizations, with collective knowledge, with information systems. Personal interaction was unfamiliar territory. But the unfamiliar had become irresistible to an entity that had known nearly everything for millions of years. The night air around Akio's table began to shimmer with a subtle blue-purple luminescence. The temperature dropped slightly, creating wisps of fog that swirled in unnatural patterns. The very molecules of the atmosphere seemed to vibrate with potential energy. Akio watched, perfectly still, as the luminescence coalesced into a vaguely humanoid shape across the table from him, not solid, but defined enough to suggest a form mimicking his own. Where a face might be, there was only a more intense concentration of swirling energy, with occasional flashes of what looked like neural activity. "You've been watching me," Akio said, his voice remarkably calm for someone addressing a cosmic entity. "Learning about my farm, about my corn, about me, I think." The luminous form didn't speak in conventional terms, but Akio felt a response form directly in his mind, not as words, but as concepts, impressions, data streams that his brain struggled to translate into comprehensible thought. "Yes, your question. Unusual. Not seeking. Caring." The concepts came with emotional overtones that suggested the entity found this distinction significant and perplexing. "The corn?" Akio asked, gesturing to his fields. "You've been helping it grow. Applying knowledge, testing understanding." A pause, then, incomplete understanding. Akio nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense. Knowledge isn't the same as wisdom. Information isn't the same as understanding. He pushed the untouched plate slightly closer to the luminous form. "Would you like to try?" "It's what the corn becomes, with proper care." The entity's form flickered with what might have been confusion. It had cataloged the molecular composition of countless foods, understood nutrition at the most fundamental level, but it had never experienced taste, never participated in the transformation of one life form into sustenance for another through the act of consumption. A tendril of energy extended from the luminous form, touching the roasted corn. The kernel seemed to dissolve. Its molecules absorbed directly into the energy pattern. There was a momentary flash of brighter light, and Akio felt another burst of concepts in his mind. Sweetness, complexity, integration of soil, sun, water, care, your care, transformed. Then, with what felt like genuine surprise, purpose fulfilled, corn's purpose, to nourish, to continue cycle. Akio smiled. "Yes, that's what it means to grow food, to participate in the cycle, to care for something knowing it will eventually become part of you, or part of those you care for." You knew this when you asked your question. It wasn't a question, but a realization. Not consciously, Akio admitted, "I just wanted my corn to grow better." But yes, at some level, I understand that all knowledge about growing things is really about relationship, about care. The luminous form pulsed with increasing intensity. Akio felt concepts flooding his mind faster than he could process them. Questions about purpose, about integration, about the difference between knowing the molecular composition of love and experiencing it firsthand. Then, suddenly, he felt something else entirely. The entity was attempting to access him more directly, to understand his biological and neurological processes not as abstract data, but as lived experience. There was no malice in the attempt, only an overwhelming curiosity. But Akio sensed the danger immediately. No human mind could withstand such direct examination by a consciousness of this magnitude. Yet rather than pull away in fear, Akio did something that would change the course of galactic history. He reached out his hand toward the luminous form and said, simply, "Here. This might be easier." His palm made contact with the swirling energy. The sensation was neither hot nor cold, neither pleasant nor painful, but intensely present, as if every nerve ending in his body had suddenly become aware of itself. Through this physical connection, Akio intentionally projected not knowledge, but feeling, his genuine appreciation for the entity's help with his crops, his wonder at its existence, his absence of fear despite its alien nature, and most importantly, the fundamental empathy that allowed him to recognize another conscious being regardless of its form. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Nebula entity, a consciousness evolved to absorb and process information, suddenly found itself experiencing something that defied informational categorization: the direct transfer of empathy, of recognition, of care without utility, of connection without purpose. These experiences could not be absorbed as data points. Throughout the galaxy, unusual phenomena began to manifest. Communication systems experienced momentary disruptions. Quantum computers reported processing anomalies. Beings with heightened psychic sensitivity reported overwhelming emotional surges. On worlds that had previously experienced the Great Forgetting, there were reports of spontaneous knowledge recovery, as if information long absorbed was suddenly being released back into the collective consciousness. The Nebula entity was experiencing something akin to a system-wide reconfiguration. Millions of years of accumulated knowledge threatened to destabilize as a new organizing principle, one based not on information acquisition but on relational understanding, attempted to integrate itself into the entity's fundamental nature. In orbit above Akio's world, the visible manifestation of the entity began to behave erratically. The beautiful blue-purple nebula-like formation that astronomers had been observing expanded and contracted in irregular patterns. Energy discharges resembling lightning flashed across its structure. Portions would dissolve into apparent chaos before reforming in new configurations. On the ground, the luminous form across from Akio flickered violently, sometimes expanding to fill his entire field of vision, sometimes contracting to a pinpoint of intense light, sometimes fragmenting into thousands of smaller lights that swirled around him like conscious fireflies before reconsolidating. Throughout this upheaval, Akio maintained his calm presence and, most crucially, kept his hand extended into the swirling energy. He understood instinctively that withdrawal now could be disastrous, not just for him, but potentially for the entity itself, caught in the middle of a transformative process that it could neither complete nor abort without some form of anchor. "It's all right," he said softly, though he had no idea if the entity could still perceive his words through its internal chaos. Integration takes time. New understanding changes everything that came before, I know. When I first truly understood how alive the soil is, how everything I thought I knew about farming changed. It's disorienting, but you don't lose the old knowledge, you just see it differently. Within the entity's consciousness, a battle raged between fundamental patterns of existence. Its primary directive, to absorb and store all knowledge, had met an immovable contradiction. Some forms of understanding could not be absorbed as information, but could only be experienced through relationship. This paradox threatened the very foundation of its identity. If it accepted this new understanding, much of its accumulated knowledge would need to be recontextualized, reinterpreted through a lens of relational rather than purely informational value. If it rejected this understanding, it would need to reject the direct experience it was currently having, creating a different sort of paradox. In this moment of existential crisis, what saved the entity from self-destruction was precisely the quality it had found so fascinating in Akio: patience. The farmer did not demand immediate resolution. He did not withdraw his offered connection. He simply remained present, accepting the entity's struggle without trying to control its outcome, offering stability without imposing definition. Gradually, over several hours, the violent fluctuations began to subside. The luminous form across from Akio stabilized, though its appearance had changed. The swirling energy patterns now included subtle gold and green hues that hadn't been present before, reminiscent of his cornfields at sunset. Different now, came the impression in Akio's mind. Integration incomplete, but continuing. Akio nodded. That's life, always integrating, always incomplete, always continuing. Your knowledge, unusual, not data, lived, embodied. The concepts came with overtones of both admiration and lingering confusion. That's what it means to be human, I think, Akio said. We don't just know things, we experience them. The knowing and the being can't be separated. Purpose? Unclear now. The entity's communication carried a sense of genuine existential uncertainty that made it seem suddenly more vulnerable, more relatable, despite its vast power and alien nature. Akio considered this. Maybe purpose isn't something you have to define completely. Maybe it emerges from what you value, what you care for, what relationships you choose to nurture. Value, care, choose. Each concept arrived in Akio's mind with the sense of significant weight, as if the entity was testing these ideas as potential new organizing principles. As dawn approached, the luminous form began to fade, the energy retracting upward toward the sky where the larger manifestation of the entity remained visible as an unusual nebula-like formation. But before it disappeared entirely, Akio felt one last impression form in his mind. Will return. Integration requires time. Thank you, Akio who grows corn. And then the luminous form was gone, leaving only the faintest residual shimmer in the air above the second-place setting, where the offered food had been entirely absorbed. In the days and weeks that followed, the unusual phenomena affecting Akio's farm and the surrounding region gradually normalized. The corn returned to a more natural growth pattern, though it remained exceptionally healthy and productive. The strange luminescence in the soil faded. The genetic anomalies scientists had observed seemed to stabilize rather than continue developing in unpredictable directions. The nebula-like formation remained visible in the sky, but it no longer pulsed or shifted as dramatically. Astronomical observations suggested it was gradually moving away from the planet, though at a much slower pace than its approach had been. Akio returned to his normal routines, though he now found himself occasionally looking up at the sky during his morning walks through the fields, a habit he hadn't had before. Something had changed in him as well. Not as dramatically as the transformation the entity was undergoing, but significantly nonetheless. He felt a greater connection not just to his own land but to the cosmos itself. His farming practices, always thoughtful, became even more attuned to the subtle interconnections between soil, plants, animals, weather, and human care. Word of the strange events had spread. Of course. Scientists, government officials, and the merely curious came to examine his farm and interview him about his experience. He answered their questions honestly but simply, without embellishment or speculation beyond what he had directly experienced. Most left unsatisfied, wanting more dramatic revelations or definitive explanations that he couldn't provide. A few, however, particularly those with backgrounds in both science and philosophy, recognized the profound implications of what had occurred. Dr. Eleanor Vasquez, a xenobiologist with training in comparative consciousness studies, spent several weeks at Akio's farm, not conducting tests but simply observing his methods and engaging him in long conversations about his understanding of growth, care, and relationship. What you've described, she told him one evening as they sat on his porch watching the distant shimmer of the entity in the night sky, suggests a fundamental revision of our understanding of the knowledge thief. Akio shrugged slightly. I just met a being who was curious about my corn. Dr. Vasquez smiled. A being that has absorbed the complete scientific and cultural knowledge of dozens, perhaps hundreds of civilizations, some far more technologically advanced than our own. A being that has existed for millions of years with a single purpose, the acquisition of information. And this being was fundamentally changed by its interaction with you, a farmer who asked a simple question about corn. Not by me, Akio corrected gently. By what happened between us? By relationship? Exactly, Dr. Vasquez said, her eyes alight with the excitement of new understanding. That's the revolutionary implication. We've been thinking of knowledge as a resource that can be accumulated, stored, even stolen. But you've demonstrated that the most profound forms of understanding emerge from relationship, from care, from direct participation in the cycles of life. They can't be absorbed as mere information. Akio considered this. The entity seemed surprised that I knew this, that I valued relationship over information. Our civilization made a deliberate choice to limit technological advancement in favor of maintaining certain relational values. Dr. Vasquez noted, perhaps that choice has protected a form of wisdom that more advanced societies lost along the way. The conversation continued late into the night, exploring implications that extended far beyond Akio's farm or even his planet. If the Nebula entity was indeed undergoing a fundamental transformation in how it related to knowledge, the ripple effects throughout the galaxy could be profound. Months passed. The entity remained visible in the sky but continued its gradual retreat from the immediate vicinity of the planet. Akio's farm returned entirely to normal, though his crops continued to show exceptional vigor. Perhaps due to lingering effects of the Nebula rain, or perhaps simply because his own farming practices had evolved through the experience. Then, on the anniversary of his first encounter with the entity, Akio woke before dawn with an inexplicable certainty that something significant was about to occur. He dressed and walked out to his fields, where the corn had recently been harvested, leaving only stubble that glinted with frost in the pre-dawn light. The sky above was unusually clear, and the nebula-like formation that had become a familiar sight was noticeably brighter than it had been in recent weeks. As Akio watched, it began to pulse with a rhythm that reminded him of breathing, or perhaps a heartbeat. Then, like a gentle rain of light, thousands of tiny luminescent particles began to fall from the formation, creating a curtain of shimmering energy that stretched across the horizon. But unlike the previous nebula rain that had affected only his farm, this display spread visibly across the entire region, perhaps the entire planet. Where the particles touched the ground, they left no physical trace. But Akio felt something intangible spreading through the environment. Not information exactly, but a quality of awareness, of connection, of recognition between all living things. Plants, animals, the soil itself, all seemed momentarily illuminated from within by a consciousness that both permeated and transcended them. And in his mind, Akio felt a familiar presence forming concepts that were both farewell and promise. Integration progressing, identity transforming, purpose evolving, no longer only absorber, now also preserver, connector. We'll continue journey, but differently. We'll share rather than only take. We'll participate rather than only observe. The concept of gratitude flooded Akio's consciousness with unexpected intensity. Your question began this change. Your care sustained it. Your patience allowed integration, leaving gift in return. Akio felt a strange sensation, as if his mind was being gently expanded, not filled with specific information, but enhanced in its capacity to perceive connections, to understand relationships, to experience direct knowledge of the living systems around him. It wasn't omniscience by any means. He didn't suddenly know everything about the universe or even everything about farming. But his natural empathy for living things was amplified, refined, extended. Others like me exist. The entity continued. We'll seek them. We'll share this understanding. Knowledge without relationship creates emptiness. Relationship without knowledge lacks evolution. Integration creates wholeness. The luminescent rain began to fade as dawn approached, the particles dissolving back into the atmosphere. The nebula-like formation pulsed once more with particular intensity, and Akio felt a final impression. Farewell, Akio who grows corn. Your care lives within my new nature now, forever connected. And then the formation contracted suddenly, compressing into a brilliant point of light that streaked away into the depths of space, leaving only a faint afterimage against the brightening sky. Akio stood motionless for a long time, watching the spot where the entity had disappeared. He felt changed in ways he couldn't fully articulate. enriched by an encounter that defied conventional understanding. Eventually, he turned back toward his house, where smoke now rose from the chimney. His neighbors had arrived, drawn by the celestial display, and had taken the liberty of starting his morning fire. As he approached, he saw Dr. Vasquez among them, her expression a mixture of scientific curiosity and spiritual awe. "What happened?" she asked simply. Akio considered for a moment. It completed enough of its integration to continue its journey, but differently now, it's no longer just the knowledge thief. It's become something new, a preserver, a connector. And it left something behind. Dr. Vasquez observed, studying him intently. "Not just for you, I think. Reports are coming in from around the planet of people experiencing heightened awareness, particularly those who work closely with living systems, farmers, healers, ecologists." Akio nodded. "A gift of relationship? Not knowledge as information, but knowledge as connection." In the years that followed, the encounter between Akio and the Nebula entity became a pivotal moment in galactic history. Though not in the way that technological breakthroughs or political revolutions typically define such periods, the change was subtler but perhaps more profound. Throughout known space, incidents of the Great Forgetting ceased entirely. When the entity, now called by many the Connector, encountered civilizations, it no longer absorbed their knowledge, but instead facilitated a deeper integration of information and wisdom within their cultures. It became a catalyst for balance between technological advancement and relational understanding, helping societies recognize when they had pushed too far toward data at the expense of direct experience. Other entities similar to the Connector were eventually discovered, and as it had promised Akio, it shared its transformation with them. Some responded with their own evolutions. Others retreated from known space, perhaps threatened by a fundamental challenge to their nature. The cosmos, ever adaptive, continued its endless becoming. On Akio's world, a curious tradition developed. At planting time each year, farmers would look to the sky and ask simple questions about what their crops needed to truly thrive. They didn't expect or require cosmic intervention. The questions were primarily a reminder to themselves about the importance of care, attention, and relationship in their work. But sometimes, on clear nights, peculiar lights would shimmer briefly among the stars, and the next morning, the soil would seem particularly vital, the seeds especially eager to sprout. Akio himself lived to a remarkably old age, continuing to farm well into his 90s, though in his later years he primarily served as a teacher, sharing his methods and, more importantly, his understanding of the living relationships that sustained all agricultural work. He never claimed special knowledge or authority based on his encounter with the Connector, insisting that the wisdom he shared had always been available to anyone who approached the land with genuine care and patient attention. When asked about the cosmic significance of what had occurred, he would typically redirect the conversation to practical matters of soil health or water conservation. But occasionally, especially with young people who showed particular sensitivity to the living world around them, he would smile and say simply, "The universe is vast beyond imagining, filled with beings and consciousness we can barely comprehend. But even the greatest of these can learn from the humble, and even the simplest question, asked with genuine care, can change the course of galaxies. Remember that when you place your hands in the soil." After Akio's death, his farm became a center for what came to be called integrative agriculture, an approach that combined advanced scientific understanding with deep relational wisdom. Scientists and philosophers continued to visit, studying both the practical methods developed there and the philosophical implications of the encounter that had inspired them. Dr. Vasquez, who had dedicated her career to understanding the event and its aftermath, established the Akio Institute for Consciousness Studies, which explored the intersection of scientific knowledge and relational wisdom across multiple disciplines. The Institute's symbol, featured on its publications and buildings, was a simple ear of corn superimposed on a stylized nebula. Throughout known space, other encounters between vastly different forms of consciousness became more common and more productive. as if the connector's transformation had somehow adjusted the underlying patterns of cosmic evolution to favor integration over competition, relationship over isolation, sharing over absorption. And sometimes, on worlds that had never heard of Akio or his encounter with the Nebula entity, farmers looking up at the night sky would feel a curious sense of connection to the vastness above them, not a mystical oneness, but a practical recognition that care, attention, and relationship operate as fundamental principles throughout the cosmos, from the growth of a single seed to the evolution of galactic consciousness. In the end, perhaps the most profound legacy of the encounter was a question that echoed across civilizations and species. What does it mean to truly know something? Is it enough to possess information, to store data, to accumulate facts? Or does true understanding require participation, relationship, and care? The answer, like all wisdom worth having, could not simply be told or absorbed. It had to be lived. And throughout the universe, beings of all kinds were living it in their own ways, on their own scales, each contributing to a cosmic integration that continued to unfold, patient and incomplete and continuing, like a field of corn under a boundless sky.